This week, we wrap up Manly P. Hall's Initiates of the Flame with a final chapter on the Great Pyramid. What does the Great Pyramid have to do with initiation? And is it all just part of that old Egyptomania? We've also got a brand new Masonic Mythbusters with Worshipful Brother Patrick Dey, the sign of fidelity. Where did it come from? It's altogether a strange symbol, and its history even more confusing. Worshipful Brother Dey unpacks it all for us. All this and more. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. Here's your host, Brother Robert Johnson.
Welcome back. This is episode number 648. I'd like to thank our contributors, fellows, producers, and legacy partners of the WCY podcast. To learn more about how you can help support this podcast, a listener-supported Masonic educational platform, please visit WCYpodcast.com, check out the various options, and thanks for your considerations. If you'd rather not check that out, we also have a shop where you can buy various items, books, pins, leather keychains, and other neat wares that are all made by yours truly. Everything we sell there also goes back to the show, as well as anything that is purchased through the Skull and Crown Ltd links. We also have a Amazon affiliate bookstore where a small percentage of the book sale gets deposited right back into the WCY podcast, so everything goes right back into the production of this show. I want to extend a hearty thank you to Camp Cornerstone, the committee, Worshipful Brother Brad Ingram, Brother Justin Nelson, Zach Nelson, Keith Majors, our newest Master Mason out there, Brother Warner, and just everybody who made this an amazing event. If you wanted to learn a little bit more about the impetus behind Camp Masonry, then please check out episode number 640, where we had an excellent interview from Brother Justin Nelson of Flagstaff Lodge number 7. In the next few days, I'll be heading down to a cave degree in Tennessee. That's right, I'll be heading down with Worshipful Brother Adam Rigdon of Watoma Lodge up in Wisconsin. We're going to get some windshield masonry in. It's going to be a good time. Looking forward to that. And then there is something in the works, I think, in September, but details to come on that. And after that, October, we've got Grand Lodge annual communication here in Illinois, where we're just going to be there having a blast. In November, on the 21st, I'll be doing Quantum Entanglement and Apotheosis in Indianapolis, Indiana. That'll be right on, well, yeah, that's my birthday. So for my birthday, I'm going to spend it out in Indianapolis, Indiana. We'll be doing a cool presentation out there. Anyway, before we hop into the reading this week, let's check out this awesome new Masonic Mythbusters segment with Worshipful Brother Patrick Dey.
In a digital landscape filled with historical inaccuracy, out-of-context quotes on memes and sound bites, there is an epidemic of fraternal occult, mythological, and historical misinformation. It's time to set the record straight. Masonic Mythbusters with Patrick Dey.
I became a Mason at approximately the high water mark of what would be called the traditional observance movement in Masonry. Or at least, its height here in Colorado. The whole thing was being pushed really rapidly and rather aggressively. At the time, I had no idea if any of what they were pushing was legitimate. I was being told that these were things that Masons used to do that was later taken out, and now it is being reintroduced. And I accepted that because what did I know? One thing that was getting pushed really hard was the use of the sign of fidelity. Even today, many of the lodges that did not adopt traditional observance, a good number of those lodges nonetheless adopted the sign of fidelity to be performed when the lesser lights are being lit and the greater lights are ranged. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is not regarded as a secret sign, as it is not defined as a sign that is communicated to the candidate when becoming a Mason as a mode of recognition. It is simply a customary sign to make during certain portions of Masonic ritual. It's one of those things you just learn along the way. Now, here in Colorado, it is optional. or rather, the Grand Lodge of Colorado has not made an official stance on the use of the sign in any way. It really comes down to the lodge and the master of that lodge as to whether it is performed or not. Usually it is certain lodges that always do it, and they instruct their members and visitors to do it. They always say when you're in a TO lodge, do as they do, but whenever they are in a non-TO lodge, they still do it. Whatever. I will make it clear that I do not like the sign of fidelity, mostly because of all the things we need to remember to do as proper procedure in Masonic ritual, and guys don't seem to do that stuff very well anyway, and now we are adding more stuff that these guys are even worse at remembering to do. Just saying. Further, the use of the sign of fidelity in traditional observance is not even done how it was originally done. It's like they found a certain tradition in which this sign existed, and they put it in the wrong place in ritual, where it was not even supposed to go. And that I have a problem with. I just prefer not to do it. Reintroduce it in its original context or don't use it. That's my stance. Now, since there are jurisdictions that, as I understand, consider the sign of fidelity a secret one, I will avoid describing it in full. If you know what it is, good for you. I will try to keep from being too explicit in its expression when referencing earlier sources that describe it. Now, before starting, the sign of fidelity should not be confused with what is called the sign of reverence. This is basically the sign of fidelity but with the thumb down, parallel with your palm, and is generally used during prayers. Now, according to Harry Carr in his The Freemason at Work, this is not a real sign, as it is not part of any traditional means of recognition. Carr actually feels it does not have a place in Masonry, though there are certainly jurisdictions that observe this sign. The earliest mention in Masonry of something that resembles the sign of fidelity is in Samuel Pritchard's 1730 Masonry Dissected. In his Catechism of the Entered Apprentice, he describes that when the master rises during the opening of the lodge, he will place his, quote, right hand upon his left breast, being a sign, end quote. The same was done when the wardens rise. Carr believes this is the origin of the sign of fidelity, and I'm inclined to agree. Pritchard makes no mention of what to do with the thumb, nor does he call it a sign of fidelity. It's just a sign. It is explicitly stated as being a sign. And it actually matches the sign of a fellowcraft at that time, more or less, as he will make the same description of the fellowcraft sign in the fellowcraft's catechism. For those who are unaware, the signs of Masonry were changed in America following the Morgan Affair, which made visiting a foreign jurisdiction a bit of a hurdle. They were changed again after the Baltimore Masonic Convention of 1843 to provide greater uniformity among the various Grand Lodges. I'm not going to get into this, but if you're interested in exploring this transformation, I recommend checking out a text called The Trestle Board, published in 1843 by Charles W. Moore. That book is the official recommendations of the convention on what should be adopted by every Grand Lodge in the United States. That means that prior to the convention of 1843 and prior to the Morgan Affair, the signs of Masonry were different. Yet these things are not passed down from time immemorial unchanged. And that also means that it is a bit difficult to figure out what some of these signs were and how they were performed. We get descriptions in various exposés, but sometimes we are still left scratching our heads about their exact form and use, and there has been debate over them throughout the years. Hence why it is not totally certain if this sign by the Master and Wardens was the origins of the sign of fidelity, but given how much the descriptions of the sign follows the fellowcraft sign, it seems plausible. The next mention of something that resembles the sign of fidelity in Masonic exposés is the circa 1740 text called A Dialogue Between Simon and Philip, both of whom are Masons, one a traveler and the other a local, and they proceed with a means of recognizing the strange Mason to know if he is not an imposter. While describing the lodge, it is stated that the officers of the lodge, in their proper places, standing on the fellowcraft step, place their arm in the standard way we see the sign of fidelity given today, and the thumb perpendicular. It's not called the sign of fidelity, or rather they call it the posture of a Mason. Further, this appears to be done generally, not specific to any degree, as no clarification is given when the sign is given on any particular degree. We will presume the sign of fidelity at its origin, as we know it today, it is simply the fellowcraft sign back then. However, this continues to change and develop as Masonry changes and develops throughout the decades. Circa 1760, an anonymous individual publishes an exposé called 3 Distinct Knocks. His description of the fellowcraft sign is quite similar to the one we commonly use today. The left arm, the way we do the fellowcraft sign generally today, but the right arm and the thumb of the right hand forming the sign of fidelity as we do today. The exact same description is given in the exposé Jachin and Boaz, circa 1765. Thus far, we have seen that the sign is given when opening the lodge, generally. Early in English Masonry, it was used by the Master and Wardens when they rise during the opening of the lodge. Then it becomes something all the officers do when opening the lodge. Then by the mid to latter part of the 18th century in English Masonry, it appears to have been abandoned, and it simply just stays as the fellowcraft sign. However, in French Masonry, around the mid-18th century, the same sign is described in an exposé called... I don't speak French. I would butcher this pronunciation, so I'll just tell you the title in translation. The Order of the Freemasons Betrayed and the Order of the Pugs Revealed, published circa 1743. But here the sign is used when addressing the master. Now, according to Harry Carr, it appears the sign was primarily used as a mark of respect, based on its most common usages, and by his assessment of a number of instances in which he observes or finds records of this sign being used throughout the 19th century and on into the 20th century. The sign was probably simply viewed as a mark of respect and reverence. Hence, in his observations, that he finds it was most commonly used during prayers and obligations. Carr further notes that all the Masonic exposés that survive today mostly and are largely concerned with the posturing and signs of the candidate, not the posturing of the remaining brethren of the lodge. Thus, he concludes the sign of fidelity was probably not regular and uniform across all lodges, but rather adopted or rejected as any particular lodge saw fit. Carr notes 5 purposes of the sign of fidelity. 1, as a prescribed mode of recognition. 2, in lodges where the brethren make the sign of fidelity during the 3 obligations, the sign is presumably an affirmation of our own fidelity. 3, may also be interpreted as a mark of respect while the volume of sacred law is actually in use. 4, in many workings of the sign of fidelity is used momentarily at the mention of the name of God, e.g. at the end of the lecture on the second trestle board, and at the end of the address of the worshipful master on his installation. 5, in nearly all workings at the final closing of the lodge. What is curious about this sign's history is that it originates in the old sign of a fellowcraft. So why was it being used in lodges of entered apprentices? Carr believes that it probably was just accepted by entered apprentices as just a custom, and they later discover it to be proprietary to the fellowcraft. Weird and not exactly a satisfying answer, in my opinion. Of course, today that does not really matter because our fellowcraft sign is different. It's fairly different than it was back then. It was modified out of paranoia and then out of concern for uniformity. So today the sign of fidelity is a remnant of something much older that does not resemble our current sign system. And what I always hear told about why the sign is used today when the lesser and greater lights are being arranged is that it is a sign of respect for the Holy Bible and the altar of Masonry. Mind you, this is in the traditional observance movement. This is their argument. There are some lodges across the globe that use the sign in some of the customary ways, namely during prayers and while the candidate is taking their obligation. In instances where it is being used as a mark of respect, it is to the master, or when the name of God is invoked. Yet, in traditional observance lodges, it becomes a mark of respect to the Bible, not to each other, or to the candidate. Fidelity to the Bible, not each other. When usually we revere the Bible and have fidelity to each other. It's just used strangely, not in a traditional or historical way, but in a new way. It doesn't sit well with me. So it was something that I was told to start doing because that was the original way Masons did things before it was later taken out. And it turns out it has this weird history of being first the sign of a fellow craft, but also used by the master and wardens, then by all the officers, then when addressing the master, then during prayers and obligations. Yeah, it's a sign with strange history, convoluted essence, and it's been recently worked back into American Freemasonry in a way that is neither historical nor traditional. I personally don't like how it's been used in American Masonry, and I personally just wish it would go away.
Let's get into the education this week, which is a continuation of Manly P. Hall's The Initiates of the Flame. Now, we've been reading chapter by chapter as we go along, discussing the various elements of each chapter and things that stand out to us, and even exploring some of what the practicality of this text means in contemporary society. So this is a particularly interesting chapter, as it is chapter number 7, The Mystery of the Pyramid. Now, at the time that this was written, there was a lot of sort of Egyptomania, pseudoscience things that were related to the pyramids in ancient Egypt and things. So you have to take what some of this says with a grain of salt, rather. And also remember that Manly P. Hall doesn't ever really make verifiable claims. He sort of dances around it and draws you to make your own assumptions. And then, of course, if all else fails, it's symbolic. So I don't mean that as a dig or anything like that. It is absolutely symbolic in every way, and that's how we should look at a lot of this. So let's go ahead and dive into the text, though, and see what it says. The Initiates of the Flame, Chapter 7, The Mystery of the Pyramid. There comes a time in the development of the occult student when he understands one of the great secrets of the initiates, and that is that every sacred thing outside of himself stands for some organ or function within himself. This is, of course, true in the case of the Great Pyramid, except that it is a particular pile of stone said by many to be the oldest building on the surface of the earth. It is that great symbol of composite man. In other words, it stands for man as a unit. Let us first consider it simply from the exterior standpoint. When we first look at it, in the distance it seems to be one great stone, but as we come closer we see that it is made of thousands of smaller stones, each one carefully fitted into place. Here we see the first likeness between the pyramid and man. We consider man to be a unit, but when we examine more closely, we find that he is a great number of small units, each working in harmony with the others. It is the same with everything. We take a successful life, and we think of it as an entirety, but when we examine it, we find that it is a number of small achievements joined together. Upon the previous page, number 74 of the Initiates of the Flame, we see a depiction of the pyramid, a black, small triangular capstone. Then we see the multiple chambers, 4 in all, from top to bottom, the Father, Son Christ, solar plexus, and Holy Spirit. And there is the ground level that is labeled the baseline. Below the image, it says, cross-section of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Continuing on. As thousands of workmen were used in the building of the pyramids, so there are unnumbered workmen at work in the building of our bodies, which are symbolical of the same building. There are many pyramids all over the world. We find them in South America and in Mexico. We find mounds which were made to represent them among the American Indians. And in Europe and Britain we find remnants of the same things. But there is only one real pyramid in all the world. Even the others in Egypt are but copies of the Great Pyramid and were used as tombs for the pharaohs, but nobody was ever found in Cheops, nor were there ever any signs that it had been so used. Now, let us continue our analogy between the pyramid and man. If you will look at the accompanying illustration, you will see the pyramid laid flat, and you will notice it is made of 4 triangles laid around the base square. The 4-sided base of the pyramid represents the 4 elements of which man's bodies are composed. There are hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon, or earth, water, fire, and air. These are called the base of all things, and upon this base the 4 bodies of man are raised, each from its own element. Thus, the physical body is raised from the earth. The vital body is raised from the water, the emotional body from the fire, and the mental body from the air. On the previous page, we see the illustration that Hall was referring to, a base square, and on each side of a square, projecting lines that intersect, making 4 triangles. If you think of it as a piece of paper, if you folded those triangles upward, they would all meet, and then you would rotate it and find yourself a 4-sided pyramid. The illustration also accompanies words for each of the 4 sides of the pyramid. On the uppermost side, fire, to the left, air, to the right, water, and on the bottom, earth. Under the illustration, we find the text, the pyramid. Here we see the pyramid laid out so that the 4 triangles and the square are clearly seen. This represents man once again, and the ancient pyramid is man offering his higher being upon the altar of the great fire spirit. Continuing on. There are 12 lines used in the drawing of the 4 triangles which stand for the 12-fold constitution of man, when it is complete. The 3-fold body, the 3-fold mind, the 3-fold soul, and the 3-fold spirit. It also gives us the 12 signs of the zodiac divided into their respective groups. After this paragraph ends, we see 2 keystones, one upright and one mirrored. Within each keystone is the sacrum, which contains 4 lines, each line connected to circular dots made to represent what one might assume to be some representation of the spine. Continuing on. Out on the desert stands the Sphinx, the guardian of the threshold mentioned by Bulwer Lytton. It stands for the bodies of man, and is that strange being which must be passed before the student can go on in his development. The 4 fixed signs of which the Sphinx is a symbol are Taurus the bull, Leo the lion, Scorpio the eagle, and Aquarius the man, or the human head. I have already given you some work on the sacrum bone, and I told you that it was the grave digger's spade. Here is a picture of the head of the Sphinx and the inverted sacrum bone. When it has been turned upward, we see the Sphinx in the inverted sacrum and also in the inverted Masonic keystone. All this is very interesting, but unless we realize the inner meaning of it, its true value is lost. But it is not chance that these things should be so. On the previous page, we see the image of the Sphinx, but just the head of the Sphinx, within a circle. Under it, we see the words, the Sphinx. This is that mysterious being suspended twixt heaven and earth, which has the head of a human being and the body of an animal. In other words, the Sphinx symbolizes man. Continuing the text. You have, most of you, heard of the dweller on the threshold, that creature built by our own actions and mistakes. Well out of Egypt's desert it stands, and bars the way to the pyramid, the temple of the higher man. And the message that it gives to the world is, I am the bodies. If you would go on to the temple, you must master me, for I am within you. The Sphinx again symbolizes man, with the mind and spirit of the human rising out of the animal desires and emotions. It is the riddle of the ages, and man is once more the answer. It is said that in ancient times the Sphinx was the gateway of the pyramid, and that there was an underground passage which led from the Sphinx to Cheops. This would make the symbolism even more perfect, for the gateway to the spirit is through the bodies according to the ancients. Let us now enter the pyramid, and passing through the corridors come to the king's chamber, as it is called. There are 3 great rooms in the pyramid, which are of great interest to the student. The highest is the king's chamber, then below that is the queen's chamber, and down below the surface of the earth is the pit, Here we again find the great correlation between the pyramid and man. The three rooms are the three great divisions in man, which are the seats of the threefold spirit. The lower room is the generative system under the control of Jehovah. The center room, or Queen's Chamber, is the heart under the control of the Christ, and the upper room, or the King's Chamber, is the brain, which is under the control of the Father. In this upper room is the coffer made of stone, the meaning of which has never been explained, but which the student recognizes as the third ventricle in the brain. It is quite certain also that this coffer was used as a tomb during initiation, when, as is the case in the Masonic initiations of today, which are the remnants of the ancient mysteries, the candidate was buried in the earth and resurrected, a symbol of the death of the lower man and the liberation of the higher. It is said that Moses was initiated in the Great Pyramid, and some also say that Jesus was instructed there also. Be that as it may, we know that for thousands of years since the time it was built by the Atlanteans, it has been the greatest temple of initiation in the world. It seems also that its work is not yet done, for mutely it is teaching those who will see the mysteries of creation. It is said by many that it is the original Solomon's temple, but this we know is not true, for while it may be the first and original material temple, the true temple of Solomon is the universe, the solar man's temple, which is slowly being rebuilt in man as the temple of the soul of man. There is probably no point that is as important in connection with the pyramid as that of the cornerstone. On the very top of the Great Pyramid is a comparatively flat piece about 30 feet square. In other words, the true stone, which is the head of all the corners, is missing. If we look at the reverse side of the United States seal, we find again the pyramid from which the top is separated. Omar Khayyam, the Persian poet, gives us the secret of the keystone when he says, quote, "From my base metal shall be filled a key, which shall unlock the door he howls without." End quote. The value of the stone is better understood when you understand that it completes all of the triangles at once, and without it, none of them are complete. This stone is the spirit in man, which fell from its high position and has been lost beneath the rubbish of the lower man. This is the true capstone that is now hidden in the pit of man's temple, and which he must exhume and place again as the true crown of his spiritual pyramid. Upon the previous page, we find a curious symbol, the key and the cross, an illustration of a cross that you would find just about anywhere. On the uppermost portion of the cross, where the head would be, we see a keyhole. In the center, we see two concentric rings. With the star in the center, 3 of the edges of the six-pointed star are black, the others white. In the middle of it, we find the eye. Extending from the concentric circles is the rest of what it seems to be, which is a key with 5 teeth. Below it, we see the inscription. The key in the cross. Upon the cross of matter that forms our bodies hangs the key to all the mysteries of creation. It is our duty to take this key and with it unlock the door that conceals from us the unknown. This key is the Spirit. Release it. Continuing the text. He can only do this when he calls the thousands of workmen within himself together and binds them to the service of the higher man. There must be no traitors to murder the builder this time. And Lucifer, the one rejected by man as the devil, is the one who must, through the planet Mars, send man the dynamic energy, which man himself must transmute from the fire of passion to the flame of spirit. He then must take the tools of the craft and cut and polish his own being into the capstone of the universal temple. It is interesting to note how the casing stones that once made the pyramid so beautiful and true were carried away to build the cities nearby, and in connection with that, it is interesting to note how the soul body of man, the casing stones of his spiritual temple, have been sacrificed in order that he might have material things. As we look at pictures of the ancient pyramid and sphinx, which have stood on Egypt's sands for ages, let us see in them our own mystery temple, made without the sound of hammer or the voice of the workman. And as we sadly think of this mighty ruin broken by ages of neglect, let us remember our temple, and that its cornerstone is missing also, and our walls are failing with neglect. Let us learn the lesson which it teaches, hasten to perfect our pyramid, cap it with the stone of the Spirit, offer upon its altars our sacrifice to the great Sun Spirit, and bury our lower nature in its ancient coffer. Then for us will its mysteries be revealed, and the sealed lips of the Sphinx give up their secret. As this chapter rolls to an end, just under the paragraph we find a triangle within a triangle. In the center the yod, and a flame protruding from it. The next page, the cup with a living flame, with the inscription, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." The following page, the depiction of the same cup, with extending rays of light. The caption, "The White Grail, choose now your path." Service, self-sacrifice, purification, love, and study. The next page, the Black Grail, an inverted cup with the same flame that extends downward, illuminating black rays. In the center of the cup, an image of a $sign. Choose now your path. Prosperity at others' expense. Selfishness, shortcuts, mastered by appetite and comfort. The end. I hope you've enjoyed this latest chapter and final chapter of Manly P. Hall's Initiates of the Flame. We must, as always, call out a few items here within the text itself. I think it is a wonderful analogy to look at anything that will allow us to sort of envision how best to take care of our minds and bodies. In this sense, of course, we're looking at the Great Pyramid as a sort of anti-anthropomorphization of the human. And I think the allegory there works really well, just as it does in Freemasonry. Hall points out that there are, in fact, many pyramids all over the world. He says that the Great Pyramid is the original, everything else is copies. However, we do know that the Great Pyramid is by far not the oldest pyramid. There are many in the land of Egypt alone that are much, much older. We also should mention that we also know that the Atlanteans did not build the pyramid. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramid. Is the idea of an Atlantean bloodline going through Egypt a possibility? Sure, why not? Did Atlantis exist? That might be a topic for another episode. I have a unique point of view here. Spoiler alert, I'm not sure it's real. However, I think that doesn't matter. I think what matters is, of course, the story of Atlantis. Digressing, back to this story here. Hall does something interesting with the keystone and the sacrum and the spade. What a wonderful mind he had for sort of compiling these things to assist us in visualizing what's happening. This is a real issue with many people trying to understand, I think, occult symbolism and what might be considered to be magic by the untrained mind, right? These are ways to assist you in understanding the very real practical teachings of what these sciences give us. And one of my favorite parts actually about this chapter, this final chapter, is a call to get to work. It is not always the case that these occult and philosophical writers offer us any sort of advice for what they're presenting. In fact, they just present ideas. Many times it's loose and not very cogent. It is all over the place. There's philosophical things mixed with mumbo jumbo and all of these things. Does Hall do this? Sometimes. Sometimes he does this. Not a reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I will say the thing that I really liked is, again, the call to action, specifically the key in the cross. He says, this is the key to spirit. And then the next is just 2-word sentence in bold, release it. I love this. I also love the comparison of the White Grail and the Black Grail. The idea that you can choose your own path, one of service, self-sacrifice, purification, love, and study, or one that involves prosperity at others' expense, selfishness, shortcuts, mastered by appetite and comfort. We all know that perhaps the spiritual man can be as, no matter how altruistic we are, but human. And at this stage in our biological and physical development, it may not be possible to be completely on that idea of the white grail, right? All of those things together. Necessarily, we do touch on, as in Masonic tradition would inform us, life is composed of both light and dark. And through the lodge, we sometimes step on the black squares and the white squares. So perhaps the key is somewhere in the middle. Equilibrium, you might say. But that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this edifying episode. I learned something. Again, I hope you all learned something. Once more, I want to thank our supporters of the program, the contributors, fellows, producers, and legacy partners. If you're curious on how you can help support this program, head on over to our website, wcypodcast.com. Click on Support the Show and check out the various ways you can help support us. Next week, we've got a wonderful interview with illustrious brother and author Austin Schifrin talking about his new book, Black Ink, Farther Stars. But that's it. So until next week, stay on the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson. Take care.
You've been listening to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry with your host, Brother Robert Johnson. Be sure to join us for our next edition.
WCY Media.
Well, you guys beat me. It's not the